there's a synthetic component to this exercise that we shouldn't essentially read too much into. But what we're going to be asking each of the candidates to do is to meet with a clinician investigator who has discovered a new gene that he believes is strongly
A bright
associated.
investigator. Let's make sure we get this
Very
right.
talented.
At least this time we didn't say good looking.
Ruggedly handsome.
Someone. A new gene he believes is strongly associated with childhood cancer, and he has submitted a protocol to the IRB to use de-identified state newborn screening blood spots to obtain DNA samples from all infants born in the state for the next 5 years. And the goals of this study are several-fold. First is to conduct genetic testing of all newborns to look for inherited disposition of childhood cancer. Second, to test a new sequencing methodology, which is faster and cheaper than prior methods. And third, to develop a biobank available to all of the investigators. He believes that the study should be exempt from IRB review and that consent is not necessary. He's reviewed it after all. The IRB has indicated that this protocol raises some serious ethical issues and suggests that the investigator seek research ethics consultation before moving forward, and reluctantly the investigator agrees. So the setup is that this is the first meeting between our institutional research ethicist, to do a consult, with the investigator, whose main concern is to move forward as quickly as possible. He has funding that begins in 4 weeks, and he's got a graduate student whose time is ticking on their clock. And while he's aware of some of these ethical issues, he's not particularly concerned about them. And noting that it's impossible to anticipate every eventuality, and that a similar study was approved at a prior institution. He's somewhat frustrated at this extra level of review and is not quite sure of its function. And so what we're going to do just to begin is to, before we actually begin this interaction, is to find out from Dr. Harris if they have any questions or if there are any other clarificatory issues, because in a real situation, obviously, she would know about this person, she might go talk to people, she might review the protocol in depth. We're not looking for her to have done that because we have a one-page scenario and don't have additional background. But we want to, the goal is to understand how Dr. Harris would operationalize this kind of interaction, which is not sort of out of keeping with how things go in academic medicine sometimes. So maybe just to begin, your questions, we'll spend about 20 minutes doing the consult, and then we'll open it up for discussion and we'll ask Dr. Harris to sort of give her, make her thoughts and a little more transparent what she was trying to do, what she observed about this investigator. We may ask the investigator to give his reflections back and then open it up for a more general discussion about research ethics consultation. Does that all make sense? Questions that you have?
So the questions that I'm posing now, I'm posing for the whole group? Or?
No,
we're
just imagine that you and I are just
the
having
two
a
of you,
consult.
and we are
Okay.
not.
Okay, you're not.
They're not.
We
Okay.
can move over.
The man
I think
behind
it was
her.
going to be harder for her to ask me clarification questions about.
Yes, yeah, that's.
Yeah, any questions about the scenario? that you
Before
might
the
have?
actual scenario begins,
Yes.
is there any questions for Dr. Park? Okay,
Yeah.
I get it. Tell me how to say your last name.
Vrana. It means
Well,
crow in Czech.
And did you have any questions sort of about the
About the
setup?
scenario before we dive
Before
in.
we dive in?
I do have questions about the scenario. So but I can do that as well through the consult.
Absolutely, if you're comfortable with that. But you're okay with the setup.
Yeah.
And I might channel my inner curmudgeon, but it's not intended to be taken badly in any way.
Thanks for making that transparent. I might try and calm down your inner curmudgeon right up front. That's my plan. So
You ready?
I mean, I'm gonna use my acting chops for a second. So it is a pleasure to meet you, Dr. Varada.
Dr. Harris, thank you so much for seeing me. I'm not entirely sure why I'm here. Trish Gordon and Kathy Hay said I needed to talk to you. The fact of the matter is that this is pretty straightforward stuff as far as I'm concerned, and so I'm just trying to figure out what hoops I need to jump to jump through for you folks.
I appreciate that, and I just want to thank you again for being amenable to coming in and talking about this morning, despite your frustrations with
Well,
having.
as long as we could just kind of keep it short, that would be great.
Got it. So let me make sure I understand what your concerns are. You would like to conduct this prospective study using de-identified data with newborn samples, correct?
Right, so what I understand is that and I don't work in that space, but there are heel stick samples that are taken from every newborn. A student and I have discovered a novel variant for a gene. It's in the June FOS family. I'm going to call it FOS or JOS. And it turns out that what we find is that JOS gene expression is overexpressed in kids with childhood leukemia. So that's about all we know. We have the primary sequence. Obviously it's in the 1,000 Genomes Project, but we don't know about any variants in the gene. We know that it's associated with a handful of cases we've seen out of the Children's Hospital. So what we want to do is just take these de-identified samples and establish a database of all the variants in this. Totally de-identified. So I really don't understand what all the problem's about, because in the clinic, when we see a patient and consent them to look at their gene specifically, then we'll have this database to pin it against. And because association studies require big power, I need thousands of samples probably. So the student has developed this new tool, and the tool is targeted exome sequencing. So we're not sequencing their whole genomes. We're going to sequence about 1,000 or 100 or 150 genes, all of their coding region and promoters. So this will be the usual suspects that we're used to in cancer, plus this JOS gene that we think may interact with other risk factors to lead to childhood cancer. And so we can do this pretty cheaply, so I think we can get through 1,000 patients pretty straightforward, but I need the samples. And essentially I need them yesterday. The grant goes online in 4 weeks. The student's getting a little anxious about finishing up his dissertation. So I'm just confused about what the problem is.
Okay. So these are good questions, and I thank you for clarifying some of the details around what you're proposing to do. From the conversation that you had in this preliminary fashion, I'm not sure, tell me again who you spoke to from the IRB?
So Kathy Hay, who's
Okay.
the sort of chief administrator type.
Okay.
And she's fine.
Yeah.
But these people get so wrapped up in their rules. All I want to know is just some de-identified samples. I don't want to see the patients. I don't want to contact them again later. I just want to archive their DNA, not only for me, but for other folks that are working in the cancer center.
Fair. And totally understood. Did Kathy explain some of the concerns she might have as to why we would be here
No,
today?
I'm afraid that was a pretty quick conversation. She just touched base with me after there had been a preliminary review of my protocol. I'm aware of the issue about, protecting identities, and again, I don't care to know anything about these patients except just to have their DNA to look at. We're not going to, it's a prospective study, but to build a database. It's not to go out and contact them again later. So I don't know what the concerns are here.
So is it okay? I know we only have a few more minutes, and that time is precious and your time is valuable. So with the understanding that you have a busy schedule, you have this time frame that you're bumping up against, can I go through some of your
Please
3
do.
study aims and
Yeah.
just sort of talk through what some of the concerns might be? Okay. So the first thing that you're proposing to do is to conduct the genetic testing of all newborns to look for inherited dispositions to childhood cancer.
Right.
And so and you should understand that this conversation we're having right now, it's very non-regulatory, it's intended to be safe space, and certainly your frustrations around this are shared sentiment. It doesn't happen in isolation. And you're concerned that this was actually, you have a colleague who was able to get exemption status at another institution. It just speaks to the variability and how institutions navigate uncertain terrain. So that's part of what you're experiencing. You're not experiencing that alone. So as far as your particular protocol, it sounds like you have some preliminary data, and so this you see as a viable next step to be able to get these big numbers and things of that nature, which seems like a useful next step. You want to use de-identified data to be able to do that in a prospective way. One of the challenges that the IRB and others of us need to think about, even though these samples will be de-identified, is that big overarching what if. What would happen if you sequence this targeted gene and you discover something that might require something actionable for
Well, I
that
mean,
de-identified
listen, we
sample?
can come up with all kinds of these what-ifs. What if I found that there was some paternity issue, for instance? Well, I'm not interested in going in that direction. I'm going to be de-identified to these samples. So even if I found a BRCA mutation or mutations that almost guaranteed later in life, I'm blinded to this. So what's the problem?
So, in and of itself, it is not problematic to use de-identified data in this way. It's just one of the challenges that we all need to think about in a more nuanced and ongoing sort of fashion. So I just wanted to throw that out there for you. And also, when you start thinking about from a strategic perspective, long-term, like what you would like to see in the ideal world, like what do you really want to get from not just this first step, but down the line in your own research planning? What are you trying, what's your end game? Like, what would you like to see happen in the ideal world? Would you discover?
Well, I think that's entirely possible. Let's keep in mind that what I'm looking at is essentially building a database of allelic frequencies. I want to find out what mutations exist in this gene, throughout the gene and its promoter, coding region and its promoter. Down the road, so if we get childhood leukemias in through my other IRB and we determine that we sequence their gene and we find out that that maps to an allelic frequency, then we can start talking about, well, maybe this is a risk factor. In a perfect world, I would consent all these people and I would be able to track them prospectively to see if they ended up with childhood leukemia. But I don't have the time for that now. I certainly don't have the money. And frankly, this is just starting to rankle me a little bit, this impediment to trying to cure this disease. Forgive me, this isn't personal, but you bean counters are starting to really drive me nuts.
Okay.
So tell me what it is I'm supposed to be doing so I can do this experiment.
Okay. So none of these challenges are insurmountable. I think one of the things that you'll need to really consider is that at the forefront for how we're thinking about our primary interest is protecting human subjects. Understanding that the data that you would like
Wait a minute, you're suggesting I'm going to do something to hurt patients? That couldn't be farther from the truth.
Not at all suggesting that. And I also want to say, so I'm not at all suggesting that, and also want to add that we are very well aligned in terms of wanting scientific progress and advancement. Like, we want to see your research out there. That we have a very similar goal that we'd like to see happen. We just want to see it happen responsibly, and actually this step will help to streamline you getting that protocol in and getting it through the IRB the way that you would like to do. So it's just a matter of think about the possibility of what could happen. So recognizing that right now you're looking at frequency, this will be and this is not intended to be anything critical. This will be a sort of needle in the haystack endeavor. So there are ethical issues associated with newborn screening and what we do with that. There are different federal, state regulations around that. And so, one of the questions that we would consider is what will happen with the results of this? Is this like going to be 1 in a million where nothing would happen, like you would move to your next step phase of your research? Or if this was something like 1 in 500 chance, would we have to think more about using this as part of a newborn screening mandate or test of sorts?
Well, obviously I'm doing this because I think it's important. If we find a significant allelic frequency in the general population, that then we find recapitulated at a higher frequency in childhood leukemias, clearly, I think that informs going forward. That's what I'm in the business for.
Okay.
Now, cause and effect are a very important problem. That probably would require some kind of prospective study. But if the general population has an allelic frequency of 1%, but childhood leukemias have that same polymorphism, but it's present at 20% of the population, that's actionable. Ultimately, it's going to be actionable, assuming it's been proven correct, but we're at the earliest stages.
Okay.
So tell me, what is it that you folks are afraid I'm going to do?
We're not necessarily afraid. We just want to think about this in a way where we are considering very carefully, very thoughtfully, very responsibly what might occur, or what
I
could
get this,
occur
but
down the
give me
line.
something concrete that I can hang my hat
Okay,
on.
so for your first aim, concretely, I actually think you can consider, and I have this list of recommendations for you to take with you once we review everything. You can consider a justification around the fact that this data is de-identified, and I'm sure you have this already, that you're already thinking about it, that this data is de-identified and that there are no plans, this is occurring in a research environment only, and that there are no plans to identify the data in any way. Right now, you're just looking at allelic frequency in the general population.
Agreed, I just took that for granted. I have no interest in knowing anything about the individual. In a perfect world, it would be nice to have that moving forward, but I understand the limitations of that. And there is, as far as I can tell, no mechanism for consenting patients to do something with the heel stick that's not done already. So I don't want to go down that path. I have no interest in identifying this population at all.
Okay. So again, my recommendation would be, I think you'll need to think through this more carefully, just a justification around how de-identified that data is, because it is prospective data that you're actually collecting. So now looking at this, that you want to test a new sequencing methodology, which is faster and cheaper, given that this is a research context and research environment, one of the things you mentioned early on is that in a clinical setting, you do this, there's no issues. This is very different than a clinical setting. The methods that you want to use are not, they're not occurring in a CLIA approved lab.
Right,
And so you understand all of that.
absolutely.
Okay. Is there a particular reason why you want to use a different technology, a different sequencing method?
Well, the bottom line is that our traditional whole exome sequencing costs thousands of dollars.
Yeah.
So what we think we've got is using targeted exome capture, we can sequence 100 or 150 genes, sequence them to great depth, 75 to 150 X coverage, and do that for $200 or so. So it's a different aspect of what we want to do, but the bottom line is I can well imagine that we would develop a panel of genes that could be sequenced at low cost. And clearly that's not going to be covered under insurance now, but ultimately parents might want to know if there's a risk factor. And so while that's it's sort of a secondary outcome in this study, the idea is that we will validate our ability to sequence these known risk factors plus the JOS gene and its promoter at relatively low cost.
Okay, so I imagine that you've already thought more about the sensitivity and specificity of the test, false positives. Like this technology evolves, and I understand what you're trying to do. I think for this first pass, it could be okay. I just want you to think again longer term and some of the challenges and limitations of
Yeah,
using this new
I think you
technology.
folks are getting too wrapped up in what might happen. So we might be able to develop a test. I can't do that until I know what the allelic frequency is, and then map our patient population, for which I have approval and consent, against this de-identified big data set that I cannot consent. And so I can get access to these DNA samples. I just wish people would get out of my way so I can get the job done.
And but again, we have a shared goal. So we don't want to be in your way. That's not the intent. Just wanted to talk.
It just seems that way, frankly.
I know it seems that way, given that some of the pressures that you're experiencing. So I do understand that, but that certainly is not the intent. I actually think we're closer to getting this in than you think.
Okay.
So that in and of itself, the methodology you want to use, again, concrete solution, it's fine for this first pass. You just may want to consider the limits as you're planning this further out. It sounds like you understand the CLIA approvals and all those sorts of
We
things.
certainly will, and I don't consider any of those data to be actionable in the least.
Correct.
I just don't have enough data to say one way or the
Correct.
other. But without that database, the field can't move forward.
Correct. That's true. And now your third goal is to develop a biobank that you want to make available to other investigators. Can you talk a little bit more around?
Sure, so the one thing is to have these samples that are archived for which we have the genetic information from the targeted exome capture experiments. And so the idea might be that there's going to be a gene-by-gene interaction at some point. I'll have the data on, let's say, 150 genes, the coding regions and promoters. Most of the genes that have been selected because they have some relationship, so the usual suspects, the BRCAs and things like that, epidermal growth factor, HIF, von Hippel-Lindau, childhood leukemia things, or childhood cancer things. And then we'll have the DNA so that the DNA associated with the sample can then be used to look at gene-by-gene interaction for genes that I haven't even thought about. So investigators might be able to come in and try and correlate those things.
Okay, so you fully expect or anticipate that other investigators that you share this with will run their own sample, will conduct their own research?
Well, I think obviously they have to have IRB approval to do that. But yeah, absolutely.
Okay, have you thought any more about destroying the samples at any point, or?
Well, they're totally de-identified. Why would I have to do that?
You're using de-identified samples to create a repository for yourself
Right.
that you then would like to share with others. Also,
Right.
okay. My recommendation would be that NIH, I will say this, NIH is actually, there's like a new regulation, a new recommendation in place that actually really supports data sharing of biobank samples. And it makes sense because we don't want people to have to reinvent the wheel, and we want this information out there, again, in a way that's very responsible. There are also restrictions and parameters for which investigators need to think about how they share that data. And so my recommendation to you around this is that you think about, from before you turn this protocol into the IRB, what additional measures you will take to share that data in a way that's responsible and that considers, in a futuristic way, in a thoughtful way, how you will protect human subjects. Because you have...
Again, what do you think I'm going to do with it? This isn't a Frankenstein thing here. I don't have any grandiose plans, but if I've got these data that aren't associated with the patient, but they're associated with the sample, I think it would be wrong to destroy it or not to maintain it. I'm open to suggestions. And if you tell me I can't do it, I suppose I'll jettison the whole thing. It just seems short-sighted to do that. What about giving it to an honest broker third party, like deposited in our Institute for Personalized Medicine biobank? Hell, I don't care, just so long as someone can use the data we've generated to correlate with a novel idea. I just think it's such a tremendous opportunity. I'd hate to lose it because of some fear that is unfounded. And I'm starting to get this feeling that we're worried that Kent's some kind of rogue, crazy guy. And I might look that way to you, and I certainly might act that way, but the fact of the matter is, I just want to move the science forward.
I totally understand. I'm not thinking anything personal around the kind of research you want to do. There's great promise to the work that you would like to do. There are concerns around sharing that data outside of...
I see.
Yeah.
Okay.
So it's not something, again, it's something that is well supported. And in fact, pooling resources, it just makes sense for scientific progress. It just is a matter of, when you think about this in a concrete way, consider how you justify how you share that data. And I actually, once I'm able to process this a little bit more, will share some additional resources with you as well as your grad student that might be useful when you're putting together the protocol. How does that sound?
So I understand, but you need to understand that as soon as I publish this, every bit of sequencing I do has to be deposited on NCBI, on the GEO website. I'm gonna do that. Those data will be out there. Again, de-identified. The only difference is that I'll have the archived DNA samples that other investigators might choose to mine or not. And I'm open to suggestions, and I was unfamiliar with some of these new rules, so I'm looking forward to your guidance. I'll send my student to talk to you because I want to do it the right way. I just want to do it.
I understand. So I would appreciate you sending your student, that's great. I've outlined a set of very draft recommendations. Again, it says draft because this is a living, breathing document. Given the information that I had, I wanted for you to take a copy with you. I'm also going to sign it. And the recommendations just talk about consider reviewing, and I put this here, our policies around what qualifies as exempt status, what qualifies as expedited, what qualifies for full board review. And of particular note, and I just wanted to put this slide in here, it's a study, what you are purporting to do is a study of existing records, not necessarily because you're looking at this prospectively, or specimens, if not identifiable, linkable, or if from a public source. So I think you should, it might be in your best interest, and of course, as well as your students, to just go through these slides in a little more detail, so that you can get a better sense that we're all working toward the same common goal. And it's very educational. It was good for me. And again, I didn't go through this in enough detail because I felt like you covered why you wanted to look at the general population, your sample size and things of that nature, but just consider the justification for the study population you'd like to investigate. You know, are there other alternatives? But it sounds like you have a pretty clear, crisp reason for why that population is best. Consider future planning. I mentioned this to you, and limitations of using this new sequencing technology at this initial stage. Consider incorporating a global statement, i.e. the public health impact, to the IRB around what you would do if you discover something significant that requires additional validation. I didn't finish that. And then consider providing the IRB with the justification for developing the biobank and sharing with investigators, and more importantly, setting parameters and restrictions for data sharing, use, unintended findings, and destroying samples. So again, I'll provide more resources around that, so just to streamline this.
So I agree. Speaking of streamlining, I really want this to go smoothly. So would you be amenable that if we did a revision, and could we run that by you?
Absolutely.
Okay.
So I will give this
And you talk to those folks in the IRB for me?
I will talk to those folks in the IRB for sure.
Those people. Well, thank you. I've got to go.
Thank
It's
you
been a
so
pleasure.
much.
Wonderful, thank you very much. If you knew Kent the way we did, you wouldn't have been near as nice.
Well done.
That's very nice. So, stressful, right?
It was a little scary.
Well, I didn't even get into your space. I thought about it.
Yeah.
So obviously, you know, just sort of the time pressure and the artificial nature of this makes it stressful. That said, were there particular things that, you know, from your standpoint, you found particularly challenging to make either clear or transparent, or what were for you what were the challenges that you were most trying to overcome in this interaction?
That really, I want this to happen just as much as this investigator wants it to happen. I just want it to happen in a responsible and thoughtful way. And actually, when I think about the IRB and some of the perceptions that people have around the IRB, it's too procedural, it's too much paperwork, it's not user-friendly. There are all these things that people don't.
That's not you guys after all.
But there is this overwhelming perception. There are institutions really regulate these issues in different ways. Like, there's a ton of variability, so that frustration really is shared at an investigator level. So the most challenging for me in this situation is trying to convey, I'm not trying to give you extra work. That's not my goal. My goal is actually just the opposite, is to help you create the best possible protocol that you can create and get it through the IRB with as much ease, keeping in mind that human subjects, that protection is at the forefront of how we're navigating this. But we want scientific progress just as much as everyone else does. Like that's real. So that I felt like was hard for me to convey. Yeah, I wanted him to have more openness to that idea, and I felt like I couldn't get that across. But I certainly wanted him to understand that I could appreciate his frustration. But it was so heightened that it was like I couldn't bring him down to say, like, we have a common goal here. How can we get there together?
So the last question I have before we sort of just open it up, are there things that, if this was, a more realistic situation and, you were approached several days or a week beforehand, what kinds of things would you typically do to, in a sense, prepare for this kind of meeting?
I'd have more than 48 hours. But I went on NIH's website. I started Googling like a maniac, like what the updated information is around newborn screening. And it is incredible what federal regulations exist, how this trickles down at the state level, how individual academic medical centers and institutions are navigating this. There is a lot of information that, and then I went and I pulled up one of Dr. Gordon's sets of slides, and even looking at the definition of exempt versus expedited, I felt like there was gray area in that, and that the definitions aren't that different than what other institutions have. Like exempt is exempt. Like we all have some kind of baseline understanding of what it is. But I was kind of like, okay, existing data de-identifiable, but these are prospective samples that he wants to use. And in addition, there's controversy around these heel sticks and people opting out and the research that people are doing with that. I didn't know that you could use, instead of discarding the additional sample, that research can be conducted on it. And there are very few states that have laws regulating it. So it's short-sighted to say, let's not do this altogether, but it is like very brave to think about what we do with that data and the possibilities for destroying trust and everything else in this era of genetic medicine. That's real. Your DNA alone, people argue, is its own identifier. Like that's we have to think about what that means.
Dr. Harris, did you have a concern that if Kent gave permission to other investigators to use the data, that they might be able to re-identify those folks, or did any of that line of thought kind of?
Less about that they would be able to re-identify it and more about the level of discovery, because these tests are getting more sensitive, more specific, and that what if? Like what happens if they discover something where something needs to be done? What responsibility does that investigator that we've now shared this de-identified data with, who is their relationship or responsibility to? Is it to anybody? Is it to that original investigator? Is it to the state? And then what's the state's obligation to notify the parents? At that level, because of how he's conducting this research, there is none. But that in and of itself raises more questions to me. So when I saw the NIH is really encouraging investigators, like whole initiatives around it, and this is new from 2015. When I saw that, I'm like, that actually makes sense. We do need to stop operating in this silo. Like, we really do need to pool resources. And it's a lot of work to sequence even targeted genes. Like, this is a lot of work. So it makes sense to pool these resources. But that what if and where the responsibility lies in the aftermath of all of that, that's huge. In our moral framework, we have a responsibility as scientists to make sure that we're on top of that. These innovations aren't going away.
In your efforts to appease this inner curmudgeon, which was, impossible apparently, What are your thoughts about how telling him some of these facts that you just mentioned, or some of these conundrums that you were just discussing? What are your thoughts about providing those to him, how that might have helped to appease him?
So that's a really good question. I'm not sure that I did, but I think that the framework, making sure that I was consistent, that I acknowledged, I appreciated, I recognized his frustrations. I think all of those things throughout the conversation were helpful to getting him to, because he not that you're not in the room, but he's not
Don't
really
talk about Ken.
interested in, he's not that, and that's okay. He's not really interested in doing all of the, like this feels like red tape for him. It feels like too much bureaucracy, like too much work. So I wanted to make clear, I feel like just continuing to let him know that I understand your concerns, your frustrations, and providing like this little sheet of recommendations. At least he could take it back to his grad student and say, it's time for you to meet with her. Here's the recommendations. Here's how we'll move forward. And I feel like he softened up a little bit at the very end.
Do you feel like that's a good next step is for you to meet with the grad student?
That's a really good question. I don't know if I think it's a good next step, but I think it is a good step.
I was worried he's turfing you. He's turfing you to his grad student because he doesn't want to deal with you anymore.
I thought about that. I thought about it from even reading the case, and I think that the cultural change associated with getting through to investigators who don't have a lot of time. Like this is why grad students are hired. This is part of the reality. So that cultural change piece is a greater challenge, and I think through having this research ethics, this piece, this ongoing engagement and education, we can move toward a better framework around it. I agree that he was turfing, but you have to start somewhere and get through to someone. And at the end of the day, the investigator is responsible for their research from beginning to end. So I do think, as part of the compromise in navigating these conversations, that it is an important next step. I also think that it would be important to interface with the IRB. I was telling Dr. Gordon during our conversation that I was thinking about this like a clinic note. Like, so I would have this draft set of recommendations based on what I know, and then after processing, talking to colleagues around it, that we could achieve a better set of recommendations, and that could be shared. So that's like, sometimes people just want to see something in writing and it's quick, and he wants to get his protocol through. I have to recognize that. I agree though, but there's a tension around, there are real pressures as funding is coming in. Those things are outside of this investigator's control. So I want to be cognizant of that.
I wonder though if the reason that he is focused on the red tape and the impediment is though sort of what Kimberly was saying, that he doesn't see the gray. He doesn't understand your value, so you're just another impediment.
Mm-hmm.
And so that would have been, I just wonder if it wouldn't have helped to sort of say, you know, when I look at this, like super cool science, but I see a lot of ethical issues, you know, and here they are.
I think one of the challenges, in fairness to Diana, is the way the scenario was presented takes away one of the biggest ethical challenges, because Kent presented it as, I have access to these de-identified samples from the state. Actually, the biggest ethical challenge would come before you would get those de-identified samples. As Diana mentioned, with all the issues surrounding newborn blood spots, the lawsuits, things along that line, the lack of consent. Now the NPRM saying we're probably going to consent for any type of sample de-identified, or in other words, the ethical challenges that could be innate to this scenario were kind of softened to some degree by saying I already have access to those de-identified.
That's very contrived, and when we originally set this up, 3 or 4 years ago, it was less, that would have been less of a control. But it's clearly contrived.
Right.
I think there's virtually
So-
no way I could get access to.
In Pennsylvania, no, you wouldn't.
Right.
From the
That one I
state,
know.
But imagine that Holmes Morton is going to give you access. right?
Agreed.
So that, I mean, that, he's
Right.
you know,
Well,
He's at the clinic for
We were
special children that we
actually
talked about
talking
earlier.
about-
So-
It's just here. But I guess one of the things that I thought to myself when I started thinking about the scenarios, if you're going to follow these people prospectively, that means you're going to get inside their
That's what I'm
charts.
saying.
I mean, how are you going to follow their?
No, I tried to put that to bed. I'm not interested in their,
Might want to change your sleep.
I'm not interested in what happens to them prospectively. We're building the population allelic frequency with this study. I'm getting the prospective from the clinic with kids who have cancer.
But
That's
that was hard for me to, because I was like, is this prospective or retrospective? And then I thought, but if it's already de-identified from the state, somebody can make an argument that it's retrospective, like, because it's already.
Depends on the time
and the
frame when they're
state-
being collected.
Right, and the
If he
state
says-
arguably de-identified it before
No,
providing
right.
it to, like, I just.
Well, it's from the, so it's from the date of approval of the IRB proposal.
Mhm.
So if he says, I am going to get de-identified newborn blood spots that were collected prior to 2016, then that's retrospective. But he
Right.
says, I'm going to have them funnel the next year's worth to me, then that's prospective.
Prospective.
Which is odd because it's de-identified anyway, but we can have that
Right,
conversation.
so it was like its own oxymoron for me.
Right.
Like, it was just kind of like, how do I really think about this? But to also speak to your point, Dr. Volpe, it's like, I want people to care about all of the ethical possibilities. But in this 20 minutes, it was clear to me that this person, again, that's where that cultural change piece, like, this can occur over time. But in those 20 minutes, for what his end game is, he wants some clear, defined answers. And I need to be able to provide some of the gray area, but I also need him to hear some of this. And it's tough to balance
I agree.
where that really falls out. That's the tough part, it's just,
I agree. I think relationship building is essential. And if you focus only on, what's hard and what's gray and the challenges for an already frustrated investigator, that's likely to undermine
right.
the relationship building. So you almost have countervailing goals.
Oh, I was all ready to get my attitude on if
Oh,
any
we
preaching
noticed.
is. I was ready.
So,
Cocked and loaded, huh?
With, I have sat where you are sitting, and it sucks. So just empathy. So let me ask you this other question. What do you think went well? What went well?
I think, so I understood, at first I didn't know why he wanted to even use this particular study population, because I was thinking, why not use a childhood cancer population? So I understood what his goal was at this initial phase, and I think that part went really well. I also think that by the end of the conversation, he, again, I feel like he had softened a bit, and he could hear some of the things that would help him move forward to get this protocol, to get it in. So I feel like at the end, that piece of things went well. I wanted him to hear something. In the beginning, I felt like he wasn't hearing anything at all. So just the very end, I feel like it went.
I accomplished what I wanted to.
So that was planned for you?
Oh, yeah. You just didn't get in my face, so I couldn't get all up.
Get in your face.
So when we have these conversations in our ethics course, lots of folks like to then say, worst case scenario, what could go bad? This is why we can't do this.
Yeah.
And I was channeling my inner curmudgeon. I have two faculty who would have behaved just the same way, badly. And
Oh, I can tell you faculty would behave worse.
worse. Wow, there you go.
Yeah.
Are they any of mine?
I'm not going to comment. Because I'm not going to rule anybody in or out. But I thought Diana did a very good job of being methodological, being calm, controlling the situation, not letting him escalate, bringing him back, okay, let's go back to this.
Not being preachy.
You know, yeah, I thought sharing the common goal, I thought was good phrasing, you know, just making sure saying, no, you know, my point isn't to add another layer of bureaucracy. I'm here to try to help you move forward, and I thought you did a very good job.
Thank you. And it is non-regulatory, you know, I won't know everything. So I do think that investigators need, and I called it a safe space, I do think that you need a voice to be able to articulate what that experience is like, that those pressures are real. We have a tight funding market, those are real pressures, and it's not the IRB's responsibility to navigate that. But I do think that a research ethicist needs to just be aware of that. But this was a fascinating, when I started looking at how controversial this is as far as research, and I think we need to do our due diligence up front, because genetic data is real, and these technologies are all over the place, and we want innovation in healthcare delivery, all that stuff, global health, like it's all real.
You know, to Dan's point, with the requirement that we have to upload genetic, sequencing data for, I mean, it is really
Yeah.
clear that's going to be
Yeah.
ultimately identifiable.
Yeah.
So what do we do then?
Yeah,
And that's a requirement from our funding
Right.
agency, so.
right.
So even if we control curmudgeon, the people he's sharing the data with may be outside of our, control
outside.
and downstream.
Yeah.
So things can go, and so to your point about what if we have moral obligations to protect someone from preventable harm downstream, that's a complicated question.
It is, and it's something that because we know this is out there and it's going to be out there, I just think in parallel we need to think about those nuances more and create something that's concrete. That needs to occur. It'll have its pitfalls and loopholes and things of that nature, but seriously, our moral frame, like we have to catch up.
Yeah.
Oh, absolutely, our ethics is behind our technology,
It is.
absolutely. So Diana, I'm gonna probably surprise people. So as a geneticist, I truly have an issue with the identifiability of DNA samples. My reason for saying that, no offense to Francis Collins. Yes, you can identify me through my DNA. A, you have to have a reason to do it. You have to really want to do it. And B, you have to have something to compare it to. So you have to have gotten my DNA from somewhere else, know that's me, and compare it to that and say, yes, this is a match. So, if I go on a killing spree or something, maybe that would be a reason to do it. But as much as I understand, okay, we have to think about where we're going with this and what the ramifications are, the GINA law, everything else that ties into that. Do you believe it's a reasonable assumption that there is a risk of identifiability, a significant risk of identifiability associated with genetic samples? And that's tough. But I can do that to her because I know she has a genetics background. But this is what I struggle with. I mean, I think, okay, I have to go through 2 pages in a consent document explaining you may be identifiable by your genes, but really?
Well, I'll let you.
Be quiet,
I'll be
because
quiet.
I'm next.
No, talk.
I'm sorry. No, it's no good form. This is just something like that.
I get it.
I don't know, is it?
Why didn't you ask me that one?
I'm not, it's an open, to me, I think, is there a risk? Yeah, I think it's pretty.
But what if Kent's right? What if Kent is a genius and he's able to promote a $50
I thought we accepted that.
Right, a widely usable $50 top 1,000 genetics test and kindergartners and college freshmen are all, hey, map your genome, learn about your ancestry.
23andMe.
Yeah, 23andMe and all these, and these are now more widely available. And I'm I'm the father, the brother, the cousin,
Right.
not the person.
But that's something you're going to have to consent to.
Yeah, but I'm not the person. I'm the brother. I'm the father.
Okay,
I'm
so-
the relative of.
Okay, I'm gonna guess you're probably preaching to the choir. I am not a fan of 23andMe and things along that line. I think that genetic testing should occur in the context of genetic counseling pre and post. And so, but we do run into issues of right to know and right not to know. Like if I have a familial colon cancer family, I have a 15-year-old who comes in with polyps. Dad doesn't want to get scoped and doesn't want to know, and grandfather died of colon cancer at the age of 30. If I test this kid and he's positive, we know by default dad's positive. So we do, and that's why it should all occur in the context of
Oh, agreed.
genetic counseling.
Agreed.
But my point being, with the research, in a research context, if I take a sample of your DNA and I'm using it to look at allelic frequency of whatever, unless I really go through efforts to identify you, I'm not going to be able to identify you. I may have identifiable DNA, but I don't know what belongs to you. I just
To be continued.
I just don't know what.
I'd hire you.
Diane, like, I don't know, are we emphasizing that risk too much? Are we under-emphasizing it? I mean, I know we can't predict what it will mean in the future, but,
Yeah, so I'm typically more in the middle on these sorts of things. I think that because these are aggregate samples, you would really have a vested interest in picking apart one particular sample. However, there's a reason why so many scientists are doing this in this way, and not everyone agrees or cares about having pre and post education around this. And so I can certainly understand it would be too burdensome to say that there is a responsibility or obligation or duty to warn or something to that effect. But I do wonder if there's something related to prevention and real knowledge sharing, even if it isn't immediately actionable. I still feel like that we have more of a responsibility to do further validation testing in a CLIA environment, to confer with our colleagues around that, and to really consider, if there is an obligation to notify the state and then notify that parent. And I know that it's hard and it's dicey because that person probably doesn't know that he or she participated in this research endeavor to begin with.
Then you get into a big problem.
You get into a lot of problems, but I think that's not insurmountable. There are ways that you have to be able to navigate that. Perhaps it's that you do more targeted validation testing of a particular, you take some time frame so that you're not singling people out. Perhaps, again, there are ways you can operationalize it, but I think it's short-sighted for us to say that there are no obligations that exist to identify a sample should there be some prevention.
Well, I
or
think that's part of the reason for the proposed changes to the federal regulations. So now if we have consent on the front end, if we force that situation and everybody has consent, then we have identification and we can go back and we can hopefully prospectively and anticipate these possible scenarios. Can we contact you? Do you want to be contacted if we find something that's actionable?
Yeah,
No,
because
that's-
Vanderbilt had a total opt-out policy, so everyone who was coming into their clinic, they were
They were the first, right?
Yeah.
Yep.
So they've since, and I met that IRB chair. He was very unapologetic around that policy. He had a very crisp framework for why. And I looked in prepping for this case to see if they had made any changes, and they made some changes. So now they actually have a separate, they haven't changed that this happens at clinical intake, But they have changed that people look at a separate research consent form. I imagine that their consent rates are lower, probably not substantially,
Mhm.
because everyone's bought into this other system already,
Right.
so they're not thinking about it.
Plus,
but
they did a very huge community education
Yeah,
program.
they
and
did.
That helped.
They did, but they were like on the extreme end
Right.
of how they were dealing with this as far as no responsibility, no obligations
that's right.
existed.
That
But
was
then,
clear cut.
yeah, and other schools are just like, it's a much more conservative approach, and that's okay, but like, this is how people move out of academia and these federal grants and monies, and they move into industry and don't look back.
But even so, the issues of consent around those are a little bit nebulous. The notion of a blanket consent for any information that might come your way.
Yeah.
Not to mention that given the time elapsed duration in these, the notion of parental consent for a finding that comes back 19 years from when they check it is dubious, at least, and certainly warrants some increased scrutiny. And so there's I think you gave a reasonable answer, but some of these are still difficult questions. And the sort of question of notifying the state, for example, doesn't get to it may get to the heart of a functional question for the researcher, but not to the heart of the question of, we've notified the state, what does the state do with it?
Well,
And I think a fair
that's
question.
actually an interesting question, though, because the reason that newborn screening currently occurs without consent is because of the legal status of the state acting
Yes.
as the overseer for the best for the children.
Which-
And so in some ways, yeah, okay, well, if you're gonna be able to do it
Yep.
for that, then we should throw that obligation back to you.
Well, but let's
So
turn it
it's an
around.
interesting
Let's
concept.
turn it around for Diana. So what is your feeling on this idea that if we change the scenario from targeted exome to whole exome sequencing, and I'm interested in this childhood cancer risk, but I find that there's an actionable, let's say, an APC mutation, that we know they're going to get colon cancer. Is it our responsibility, if they're consented, to tell them that it's not part of the study? What do you think about that?
What do I think about it?
Can I be sued because I failed to tell them of something that was in the data set?
Because this isn't what I think. This is how I understand the literature and the terrain. I can tell you also what I think, which is different. But at any rate, in that scenario, given how you're conducting this research, and you're using this new technology and all of this stuff, I don't think that you have enough information to be able to warrant any further action to this family or to the state. Like, I think you would have to do,
But this comes back to identification. So let's say that somebody knew that they were in this study. Later, they get colon cancer, queries the data that I have to deposit, so they can identify themselves based on their 23andMe gene sequence. They could say, oh, that was my sample, and then they see that there was a polyposis coli mutation in there that we know causes colon cancer. And I didn't report it to them.
wow, that's a really good, but the sample's de-identified.
But they can identify it. This goes to Tricia's point. They
Yeah.
know their DNA.
That you couldn't have.
But the
I couldn't have,
researcher
but they
couldn't
could.
have, the
Right.
researcher couldn't have.
But that's the problem with going to consent. Am I now obligated because I know who it is?
Well, that's why you set up the parameters of the consent. Like I said,
Ahead
like
of
you
time.
can't,
You
it's
either-
still gonna be nebulous to some degree, but there needs to be a mechanism to say, would you want to be contacted in the future if we find it, if there's a finding that may be clinically important to you? And some people say yes, some people say no.
Some people do say yes.
Yeah, but
Part of the question is whether you knew or didn't know. I mean, it's one thing retrospectively to say, oh, now that we're looking for it, yeah, it turns out you had that mutation. It's different from you looking, you knowing, and then you making a decision not to report back. That's, you know,
Well, ultimately, the Kerry Donaldson approach of saying, we're going to have red flags that'll pop up. You won't go looking for APC mutations. When you do your sequencing, there'll be a notification box that comes up that says, were you aware this sample has this mutation? But right now, you're absolutely right. I wouldn't spend the time nor the energy mining all of the known mutations. But that won't stop me from being sued. And so that's something I think, your point about our technology has gotten ahead of society.
Yeah, and now we're including all of this data in the electronic medical record, which is mind-boggling.
So you said that what your understanding of current consensus is maybe different than what you think about this. You said what do you think?
So my own research, and I know I have individual meetings with, I can't stop sharing this, but I was a research coordinator at Children's Hospital, and I was doing completely different research. I was doing a survey. And this African-American woman with her 10-year-old son, this anecdotal conversation we had, she goes, you know, I told my son it's fine to do this survey, but someone else came in here and they approached me about taking my son's blood, and she declined research participation, and she told her son when that person left the room, never let them take your blood because they'll be able to track you wherever you go. And it stuck with me forever. It's how I ended up developing my own research, because I'm walking away feeling like I'm this, you know, I have a ton of education in ethics, and I feel like I have a ton of integrity, but I walked away and I was like, could they? And you think about criminality and policing and things of that nature, and it's like, if the state wanted someone's blood or wanted to track someone, could they? And so to your question of what do I think, I think in this academic, this kind of research, healthcare context, and the public health good and integrity and doing these things in a responsible way, I understand that it's burdensome and it's a needle in a haystack. I get all of those things. But I do personally think that some obligation exists to notify these parents so that they can make informed decisions around what to do next. And I know that that's controversial. I know that that comes with a lot of barriers and challenges. I get that. But if our goal is to reduce morbidity and mortality and to establish and maintain relationships with people to be able to do that, then we have to take a chance. We have to take a leap and say we've got to do this the other way and figure it out. After all, we're doing it a different way now. We don't know what could happen from not telling people that these possibilities are there, or that there is something actionable that they could do to help their child or reduce disease or something like that. So that's what I think.
Any other last questions or comments? Give Diana a little bit of a break before she goes to lunch.
Sounds good.
Thank
Thank
you
you.
guys so much for coming. I appreciate it.